Now that we've finished talking about the telencephalon, we're going to move on to the diencephalon, which is the second component of that prosencephalon. And we're going to look at the thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus particularly. So the diencephalon, you can see here, kind of in the center of your brain, is going to be composed of the epithalamus, which is the roof of the diencephalon. It's going to contain the pineal gland, which we'll see at the very back there. We'll have the thalamus, which you can see here in the center. And in the center of the thalamus, you can see this little adhesion called the interthalamic adhesion, or here they're calling it an intermediate mass. It's just connecting the two thalami together because there's two of them. We'll have a hypothalamus just below the thalamus. And then kind of coming off that hypothalamus, we're going to see part of the pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary is direct descendant of that hypothalamus, and you'll see that better on another slide. And then finally, the last part of that diencephalon is the part of the third ventricle goes right through that diencephalon. So the diencephalon is the actual neural material, and the third ventricle is just that cavern in between them. All right, so let's look at the epithalamus. Epithalamus is the dorsal part, or the roof of the diencephalon. It's going to contain the choroid plexus of the, which is part of the roof of the third ventricle, and that choroid plexus you learned before is making our cerebral spinal fluid. And it also holds the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin. And that melatonin, you may be familiar with hearing about your sleep-wake cycle. And it's all kind of directed from light that's coming in. And when you have light that's stimulating, it prevents that melatonin from being produced. And then when it becomes dark, then the melatonin will be produced, and that tells you it's time to go to sleep. Which is one of the problems we have with computers and technology with having all these lights on, is that it's tricking our brain to always be awake, and we have trouble shutting this thing, or shutting off these inhibitory signals to get to the pineal gland so that we can go to sleep. We can also trick it the other way when we're traveling and you are going into a different time zone and you need to sleep more. We give people melatonin because that's what the substance this pineal gland is, and that's going to help you fall asleep easier. Now we can move on down to the thalamus. And the thalamus, there's really two thalami organs. They're a paired mass of gray matter, and there's really a ton of nuclei. I think there's like 23 nuclei in each thalamus. And those nuclei are going to be responsible for different regions of the body and different functions. But what the main purpose of this thalamus is to be a relay center. I kind of mentioned that before. It's taking all of the sensory information that you're gathering from your body, and it's relaying that up to the cerebral cortex. So if it's on the motor side, it's going to be going to that prefrontal cortex and primary motor cortex. But it's also going to be sending sensory information to that primary somatosensory cortex and to different lobes of your brain. Now, the interesting thing here is that it does all sensory except for smell. So remember that olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, is coming in above this. And so it's going to go in directly to the higher centers of the brain and bypassing this thalamus. So the thalamus, we've said before, is important in refinement of many motor programs. So it's coordinating with that basal ganglia or the basal nuclei closely, and also with the cerebral cortex. So it's going to end up setting that information up so that the final motor program can come down. And it's based on all that sensory information it's gotten in the latest sensory information. It's also going to be very important in alertness and arousal. You're going to learn about a reticular activating system that's sending information in to wake you up when you're asleep and to keep you stimulated. And that's all coming up again through this thalamus here. Here's just another way of seeing that thalamus, and you can see how it's sending all this information to that primary somatosensory cortex so that you are aware of those senses. But you can see it's also sending it to many other places: the auditory cortex, the visual cortex, the gustatory cortex, which is for taste. So it's getting all of this information and sending it to different parts of the brain so that you can be aware of it and your brain can function and make plans based on that. Moving on down, so if here's our thalamus, if we go inferior to that, we'll be coming into our hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is, again, a bunch of different nuclei that are putting out a bunch of hormones. So we call this the master gland because the hypothalamus is putting out hormones that are going to control the release of a lot of other hormones in the body. So this is really the main integrating center of your body. It's going to be in charge of things like hunger and satiety and thirst, heat or thermoregulation. Again, your sleep and wakefulness, because you're going to see some of these nuclei like the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's going to be controlling or sending information to that pineal body back in the epithalamus. It's going to be dealing with emotions and fear and anger and pain. So it's going to be dealing a lot, remember, with the limbic system. The hypothalamus is very tied in closely with the limbic system. And then it's going to, again, control the endocrine system. And a lot of that is going to be coming by dealing with the pituitary gland. And there's going to be two ways that you're going to see it deals with the pituitary gland when we talk about the endocrine system. But for right now, we're going to look at just how it deals with the posterior pituitary gland, because the posterior pituitary gland is actually, some sources will say it's part of that diencephalon, because it's an actual descendant of that hypothalamus. And I'm going to show you just a couple of nuclei here that are going to be important that we'll talk about with this hypothalamus. First one is the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And that suprachiasmatic nuclei is sitting right on top of the optic chiasm. That's what this little bump is right here. So you got to imagine your optic nerves kind of coming out, going to each eyeball, and this is where they cross, and then they're going to go back towards that thalamus and occipital lobe. So you're getting a lot of light information here. That light information, some of it's going to get transferred to the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which through a couple of kind of convoluted pathways is going to end up going to that pineal gland back here and help to control the release of melatonin. So that's suprachiasmatic nuclei. Then we had supraoptic nucleus, which is above the optic region here, and this is going to be producing a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Diuretics make you pee, so antidiuretics make you retain water. And we're going to see that antidiuretic hormone is going to be very important in helping to control our blood pressure and our blood osmolality. So that hormone is made up here in the hypothalamus, and then the nerve actually comes right down through this infundibulum, and it's going to release onto a capillary bed in the posterior pituitary gland. So the supraoptic nucleus and this paraventricular nucleus operate in the same way. They're making their substances here. The paraventricular is going to be making oxytocin, which is going to be really important for labor contractions of the uterus, and also for milk. When you have milk let down in your nursing, it's going to be important for ejecting that milk out. Also makes a little bit of ADH in there, depending on the sources that you read. Both of these are manufactured or produced in the hypothalamus, and they're secreted, sent out into the bloodstream in the posterior pituitary gland. And it, again, is going through that infundibulum. So here's our posterior pituitary gland secreting the ADH and oxytocin. And the anterior pituitary is a whole different ball game, and we'll talk about that in a later chapter.